All right, welcome back, guys. We actually have a little bit more to do for this section 6, and that's to talk about this identifying which procedure to use. Now that we've kind of covered a few of the basic statistical procedures, I think it's helpful to just spend a few minutes talking about how to decide if you were to collect your own data. Um, how to decide which of the or when to use all of the stuffs that we've talked about. And so this handout you'll kind of do on your own. I'm going to flip to the back side, and we did something similar to this when we talked about which graphic to use. And so the way we're going to break this down is, so we started with one sample proportions, then we did our chi-square tests, then we did one sample means, and then we did regression. And so we're going to break this down by first by the number of variables. So we've got one variable, and then I'm going to go about a little more than halfway down to write two variables. And then I'm just going to go in chronological order for our class. And so we started with one variable, and that variable was categorical. So that's where we spent all that time on proportion problems. And so if our categorical variable just had two levels, then that meant that we were either going to do a one proportion, and is it okay if I abbreviate confidence interval CI just to save on writing, or hypothesis test. Our plot that we looked at, if we had this type of data, was a bar plot. So that's the plot that we talked about way back in like section 2. If our categorical variable had more than two levels, then we did a chi-square goodness of fit test. So that was like that Pokemon example where, since there were 3 starters, there were 3 levels of that variable preference, and our plot that we used was still a bar plot. Okay, so then moving along chronologically, then we stuck with categorical data, but the next test we did, we had 2 variables of interest, and we wanted to see if those variables were associated. So 2 variables, if they're both categorical, that's when we did a chi-square test of association. And the graph that we did was a side-by-side bar plot. So like we had that baseball example where we looked at if, what did we look at? Whether or not hitting 10 or more home runs was associated with player position. Both those were categorical, so we did this test, and our plot was a side-by-side bar plot. Then we left categorical data, and we went to one variable, but that variable was now quantitative. And so if it was quantitative, then we did our one sample mean confidence interval or hypothesis test. And the graph that we looked at for that was either a box plot or a histogram. This we introduced with models, where we had like a really basic model with no predictors and just one quantitative variable. And so the example we did for that was we looked at that GPA data, where we were interested in modeling first year GPA at that unnamed school. And so then we, from there, jumped into looking at 2 variables. And so in this setting, we always had a quantitative response. And the first thing we looked at was, well, okay, what if our predictor was also quantitative? So those are our two variables, quantitative response, quantitative predictor. And the setting that we did for this was regression. And more specifically, regression with a quantitative predictor. The graph that we used to look at this data was always a scatter plot. And then finally, what should be fresh since we just did this is having a quantitative response, but a categorical predictor. And what we did for this was still regression, but just noting that our predictor was categorical, which changed some of the interpretations, but didn't really change a lot of the algebra behind the tests. The plot that we used to look at this data was side-by-side box plots. Okay, so where we're going with our final section, you might guess that the next logical thing would be to consider a two-variable situation where your categorical variable is the response. But that's actually kind of a more complicated situation that is discussed in Stat 213, but not in this class. So where we're actually going next is looking at the possibility of having more than just one predictor. So what if you had a regression model with a quantitative response, but maybe you had 2 categorical predictors and 5 quantitative predictors or whatever. So that's where we're heading next. The handout will kind of give you some examples for practice on how to choose which of our procedures to use. So that's about it. Hope you have a great morning, afternoon, evening, or night.